This week on Flying Through Time, we'll be looking at one of the many legendary planes designed by one of the world's most awarded aviation designers, Kelly Johnson. We'll be following the path of the much maligned but equally inspiring F104 Lockheed Star Fighter. From Kelly's initial concepts in 1952 through the painstaking development, and then wonder what could have been after the last 104 was produced in 1983, a production run that lasted over 30 years. Kelly Johnson first came to the Lockheed Company in 1933 and was hired as only the sixth engineer of the fledgling company. He'd come to the notice of company engineers when he was supervising the wind tunnel testing of the company's Electra at the University of Michigan. His insights and constructed concepts on the Electra and subsequently the Hudson bomber led to his rapid rise in the company. The Hudson bomber Kelly single-handedly designed at the age of 29 was then redesigned to meet the British specifications in a number of days in his hotel room to seal the Lockheed order, which eventually ran to 3,500 planes. Kelly's list of achievements is stunning, such as having input in over 40 of the world's most renowned aircraft, and over half of these were his original design. His innovative and intuitive work brought great reward for the company. One outstanding example of his unconventional design concepts is the P-38 Lockheed Lightning. America's first 400-mile-per-hour fighter, the design was totally unique for the time. Two-engined, using liquid-cooled inline instead of radial engines, tricycle landing gear, overwhelming operating ranges and payloads, yet able to outmaneuver many single-engine fighters. The dual-boom fuselage concept was totally at odds with the thinking of the day, but showed the design's daring at that time. After significant testing and development and several years of operation, the P-38 became an amazing fighter by any consideration. It could fly farther, faster, at a greater height, and carry much more payload than any other fighter. After the war in the Pacific, the drive to develop military aircraft took a sidestep in favor of domestic planes and development of jet engines. However, with the onset of the war in Korea, the sheer numbers of the Russian MiG-15 shocked many with the state of the Russian plane's development. The American pilots flying their Sabres, who were used to their air superiority, were being increasingly pushed in the air war by the MiG-15s. At Lockheed, the direction of future projects had been varying between using the existing engines in lighter planes or heavier, more powerful planes based on the concepts of new jet engines. Kelly Johnson, on his visit to Korea, was left in no doubt about the requirements for the next step forward. The American pilots he'd spoken to were demanding a plane with vastly better speed, height, and climb parameters. With the need to be higher, faster, and to be there quicker, Kelly's decision was for a lightweight fighter designed for high subsonic cruise and high supersonic combat speeds. Almost immediately, the most controversial point of the 104's design was decided upon: its incomparably small, thin wing. This flew in the face of the design thinking of the time, which was for larger swept wings on all transonic planes. Soon, many wing designs of this concept were being wind tunnel tested. Then, more unconventionally tested, bolted onto Army 5-inch rockets. These proved to be a very valuable tool for the testing of not only the design's limitations of shape and construction, but also the stresses speed and acceleration would cause at lower altitudes. The next point of the wing controversy was that the wings were to be bolted onto the sides of the fuselage with precision-forged aluminium fittings, not going through the plane, as with most planes of the day. With such small wings, they required a totally new boundary layer control system. The wings needed leading edge and trailing edge flaps, and a boundary layer control system which is used in conjunction with the trailing edge flaps to reduce landing speeds of this manned missile. The first step in the manufacture was the building of the model fuselages in full scale and the creation of the jigs to cradle the entire plane. As the Air Force had not asked for submissions for the 104, if it were not for the credibility of Lockheed and Kelly Johnson and the lessons being learnt in Korea, the 104 may never have gone into production. As it was, they were impressed and perceived a need enough to order prototype testing on an experimental contract. In March 1953, the contract was issued and Lockheed went straight into production of the first two prototypes. The first flight took place only 12 months after the signature of the contract. The achievements in that 12 months are stunning. Its concept had only been developed in late 1952. It wasn't some idea that had been sitting on the file for an extended period. This was on the cutting edge of technology for the time. On March 4, 1954, the 104 made its first official test flight. After an extensive testing sequence of the flight controls, the test pilot, Tony Levere, took to the air for the first time. Although the engine used in the test aircraft couldn't push the plane past Mach 2, Lockheed's design and concepts of the lightweight interceptor were decisively proven. In spite of the prototype's tests not achieving the airframe's Mach 2 speed, the US Air Force placed an order for 15 more planes and uprated power plants as F-104As. In April of 1955, one of these broke the Mach 2 barrier. With the long development period and the plane's extreme performance being very unforgiving on an unwary pilot, a test flight sequence of over 8,000 flights using 52 aircraft still left a guarded attitude with the Air Force, and Lockheed were left with the inference that the plane was still on trial. The contracts issued were the first to be on a fix then fly basis. Previously, the Air Force would assume some of the testing itself. With the cutting-edge technology of the 104, the responsibility was returned to the manufacturer. This is now the accepted practice. The 104 concept arrived at the overlap of two technology ages, which meant that almost all of it was untried. One of the best examples of this is the Vulcan M61 cannon. 6 foot long and 308 pounds in weight, mounted on the nose, it could fire 6,000 20mm cannon shells in a minute. The 6 rotating barrels, firing one at a time, permitted a high rate of fire, while at the same time reducing the problem of barrel wear and heat generation. It also virtually eliminated the problems associated with recoil. Being driven electrically from the plane reduced the problems of corrosion and fouling. At the time, it was the fastest gun of its kind in the world. Comparisons to even the existing multiple machine gun installations are almost meaningless because the Vulcan outperformed everything else by such a margin of superiority. The troubles it caused in the 104 should be accepted as the trialling of any piece of advanced technology. At first testing of the gun, the pilot, Tony Levere, after a perfect initial test, proceeded to the second pass. When firing the gun, the plane lost all engine power. He was then forced to glide back to land, soon committing himself to passing below the level which was safe to use the ejection seat. After his hair-raising landing, it was confirmed that the gun had caused the problem. One of the shells had ejected backwards through the base plate and into the plane. With the sheer performance of the plane and its weapons expansion and wider tactical capability, it was now the yardstick by which all others were measured. In 1958 and 59, it set new records in many fields to reinforce its potency. Even when the new F4 Phantom II broke some of its records, the 104 went out and reset them again outside the F4's capabilities. As the prospect of significant US Air Force orders diminished, another market quietly revealed itself in Europe. The sales program outside of the US not only saved the 104 project, but made it into an outstanding success for Lockheed. The Starfighter eventually went into service with 14 air forces and was the nearest to a standard Western fighter aircraft to be achieved. The control systems were tailor-made for individual air forces, and it was put to many and varied uses. One design that saved the 104 was the two-seat variant. US fighters usually included a two-seat version for reconnaissance or training. The Starfighter was no exception. The German Luftwaffe were primarily looking for a ground strike aircraft, but also a multitasking platform for various developing areas. The twin-seat variant was particularly appealing to them. Many more abilities which had been deliberately omitted from the original design were now being considered. As the NATO alliance was seeking to standardize their air forces, the German order was seen as opening this market to Lockheed. The Luftwaffe order was so important to Lockheed that some almost incomprehensible capacities were required from the plane, including barrier landing strength. The Starfighter itself held no problems in coping with enforced rapid deceleration, but the challenge to the pilots was another thing entirely. The whole concept required courage and nerves of steel in bringing it to a successful and safe conclusion. One other more definable addition to the package was the facility of in-flight refueling, by today's standard a mundane requirement of almost all fighter aircraft. Extensive trial and error testing and retesting of the new technology in various forms from myriad tanker aircraft delivered the ability and vastly extended the operational range of the Starfighter. Lockheed's production offset sales strategy would see starfighters manufactured by groups of different European aviation factories. This was the clinching factor in the sales campaign, as it would provide a much-needed boost to the ailing European aviation industry in general. The competition for the contract was very serious, and some of the other competitors were very good aircraft. But by the time it was over, the 104 proved itself to be the outstanding aircraft in the competition. The plane performed effortlessly in the fly-offs, and its edge on the other competitors was so obvious that it was almost no contest at all. By this time, the Starfighter had developed a reputation of demanding the best from its pilots and being very unforgiving if mishandled. But it also had a reputation as being the hottest thing in the air. A well-maintained 104 in the hands of a trained pilot had very few problems, but in the hands of untrained personnel, many accidents occurred. In spite of the common knowledge that the German Luftwaffe had a particularly troubling time with their 104s, losing over 200 planes in accidents, little if any blame can be attached to the aircraft itself. No other customer had any experiences even remotely similar to the German problems. The customer air forces developed many different roles for the 104. In fact, some aspects of the plane were still under development when the last ones rolled out in 1983. When the American Air Force chose not to accept the 104 as a major part of its inventory, it took on many of the other Century fighters. These were all much larger planes that shared, with varied degrees of success, state-of-the-art technology. The 100 Super Saver, the 101 Voodoo, the 106 Delta Dagger Delta Dart were all part of this series, and all disappeared into the annals of history very quickly, even with some limited service in the air over Vietnam. Each of these planes, as fighter interceptor aircraft, took on the guise of a roving missile platform, although with time, each was developed into other varied roles. The Russian Air Force had also learned many lessons in Korea. Their outstanding MiG-15s had now developed along very different lines to the Americans and had become the MiG-17. The MiG-17 was built to be a short-range interception fighter with very high performance, rate of climb and turn. The MiG-17s were in reality an updated MiG-15 with more swept wings and better handling. The MiG-17 was produced in very large numbers, although it should have been obsolete before it even took to the air. But it proved a very effective plane in the air over Vietnam in the mid-60s. It's doubtful if any of the planes in this era could have coped against the 104. Even today's more modern planes would have some problems with the performance of the 104. The 104, later redesigned with larger wings and much more maneuverability as the Lancer, was entered as a concept in the competition that brought the F-15 to mass production. It would seem that the Lancer, for some reason in the thinking of the time, failed to impress, and none were ever put into production. Kelly Johnson maintained that the Lancer would have run rings around the F-15 and thereby everything else at the time. There's even a body of opinion that says in aerial combat, the 104 itself would give the F-15 significant problems. Although the last of the starfighters was built in 1983, these exceptional aircraft served for many years, but were finally withdrawn from service by the mid-1990s. The only variant still surviving is the F104S, built under license by Alenia in Italy, for use in Italy and Turkey. Despite the age of the F104, the S model has proven to be cost-effective, reliable and popular among pilots, giving the F104 a new lease of life into the new century. The attention to detail and scrutiny of the plane through its long development is without precedent, and it set the ground rules for today's methods and technology of testing. These areas have never been the same since. Despite never being free of controversy, it has more than validated the decisions of its designers and carved its name forever in the pages of aeronautic history. Join us again on our next search through our brief but fascinating history of flight and aviation. Come with us and meet the people, the planes and the companies that have created the world's most technologically advanced machines. That concludes another episode of Flying Through Time. Join us again next when we further delve into our short but colourful history of flight.